gospel for today comes from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. And it's found on page 74 in your New Testament if you'd like to follow along. Hear the good news for this day. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus said this to test Philip, for Jesus knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up. And from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "Is it I? It is I. It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is our good news for this day. Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, God, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Grace and peace to you from God, our Creator and our Savior and friend, Jesus Christ. Amen. You can't read this. It says, "I can make my God say anything I want him to." When I think back to my transformation of faith that I've gone through from being a child into a teenager, into an undergrad, into a seminarian, when I think about that whole process, I always come back to one very embarrassing fact. I have always made God into my own image. My own desired way of being for God. A God that I can wrap my mind around. A God that is usually very, very small. Small enough to fit in my pocket. Small enough that it will never get bigger than me. Never big enough to really take charge of my life. You know, I've gotten to the point now where my prayers are so fine-tuned that there is no wiggle room on what God has to do to fulfill them. You know, we sometimes treat God like that magic genie where if you pray for $100, suddenly you got 100, male deer coming through your door. You don't want to give God too much control because you don't know what God might do with it. Before I believed in God, I threw away God because the idea of an eternal being was ridiculous to me. Even now, it breaks my brain to think about it. How can something exist for forever? If we are inside time and God is outside time, what did God do before us, before there was stuff in forever? It's the kind of thought that just turns your brain to mush. But even in my rejection of that God, a God that I said wasn't possible, I had formed an image of God, a God that had to be this way so that it did not exist. I'm an individual that doesn't even fully understand how a battery works. And somehow I think that I can understand how long a forever powerful, omnipotent being can last. But that didn't last long. An amazing thing happened. God spoke to me, and when God spoke to me, I knew God was real, and I knew then that the Bible was real. And I knew every word of it was true. So I read the whole thing, devoured it. And suddenly I knew everything about God and the world. I didn't need a single commentary. I didn't need to go to seminary. I understood everything. I was that good. And I knew what God liked. I knew what God hated. I knew what was sinful, and I knew who were sinners. I knew that people went to hell, and God was okay with that. I knew all of that stuff. God was the God you heard shouted from street corners and fundamentalist pulpits. God suddenly became so very easy to understand. I had an answer to every question. You asked me, what happened with this? Well, here's the truth. Keep in mind, I was like 13. 13-year-olds always have the right answer. But God became very easy to understand. And here's the truth about that. The easiest way for you to know if your theology, if your understanding of God is a little screwy, if you think God is easy to understand, you are very far from understanding God. The last thing God is easy to understand. God is the most complex being that has ever existed, and we think that we can make him small. But now I'm better than that. Now I have a higher theological education. I have mastered divinity. That is literally my degree. I mastered of divinity, but I have mastered divinity. I now understand it all. And I remember thinking, okay, God is in that church, God is not in that church. God is working with that person, God's not working with that person, because God wouldn't work at that church because their theology is bad, so God's not there. God's only in the churches that I like and working with the people I like. I'm the only one that can judge them correctly because I've mastered divinity. I think about other religions. God wouldn't work in that other religion because I'm the right religion, and so God would stay with the right religion and only work within the right religion. And we go beyond that. Communion only can happen in one way. The Bible can only be read in one way. Outreach, how we go outside our walls, can only be done in one way. Our interaction with the government can only be one way. God can only work in one way, right? And you know what way that is. Our way. More importantly, my way. But as happens, time and time again, God comes and opens my eyes to the reality of the truth behind it all. I don't know squat. God is so very, very big. Picture the biggest, most complex thing you can imagine, and now make it infinite. That's the being that we're talking about, that we think that is easy to understand. And our gospel has these major, big stories about this God. and what this God did when God was among us. Two major stories. Two stories you could probably tell from memory. These are the two stories that were left out of last week's reading that had me bothered that they left them out. But here they are this week. Jesus feeds thousands. Jesus walks on water. But the most amazing part of these stories, we normally focus on Jesus feeds 5,000 people out of 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's a big deal. Jesus walks on top of water. Who doesn't want to do that? That's a big deal. But save us on boats. No more foot fare. I guess that would be the first literal foot fare. Even though those miracles are incredible, it's the end of the story that is truly striking in both of them. Both of these stories have an odd ending that you would not expect. You would hope that's not how we would react. But that's probably more than we can hope for. With the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus accomplishes this great miracle. But then, instead of just letting Jesus go on, because he's proved his power, they think he's this great prophet. They don't fully get who he is yet, but they think he's this big, important thing. And instead of saying, you know what? You're from God. You go ahead and decide what we'll do next. Or maybe you could teach us something. Instead, they say, we know what you need. You need to be king. And we're going to make you king. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. He had to run away after feeding 5,000 people miraculously to the point where they had 12 baskets of leftover food. We'll make you king because we know better. But Jesus had to go off for a while. He needed time to regroup, to remember who he is, to commune with this very big God. The God that we put into a tiny box. By the time Jesus goes to find his friends, they're a long way gone, out in a boat. So again, he makes another miracle and walks on water to meet them. At first sight of Jesus standing on the water, they're terrified, but then they move to the amazement of his power. He is truly a powerful God. They've just seen him feed the 5,000. They're seeing him now walking on the water in front of him. And then they do something incredibly annoying. They invite Jesus into their boat, into their version of safety, into their vision of what Jesus would want. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, and coming near the boat, they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat. And immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. Now here's why I find this annoying. What is Jesus doing? He's doing something that we say can't be done. He is walking on water. In that moment, he fundamentally shattered everything that we know about what it means to be human. And instead of asking, before you get in the boat, Jesus, what else can humans do? Can we fly? Maybe that's too much. That's asking too much. If we multiply food, how much can we multiply? Does it have to be bread and fish? Or are there other things that we can do? Or spiritual vision. If we can see the world as it actually is, what does that look like? What are the limitations of prayer? How much can we change just by getting together and talking to you? If we can walk on water, is there a distance? You made it 3 miles. Maybe can we do 5? Instead of any of those questions about who he is or what we could be, The disciples pulled Jesus into their boat, into their small worldview, into their floating box, so to speak. Or at least they tried to. They hit land before they can rescue Jesus. I imagine Jesus standing there as the waves lap at his feet, cold wind blowing around him, looking up at the stars overhead, seeing them twinkle. I imagine him just thinking these thoughts about what humans can be if we would just put aside all the things that are holding us back. If we just stop making God so very small and allowed us to see that we are children of God, who now literally have God inside us. What could we do if we put it all away and just went towards that? We're told we could do greater things than Jesus. And he just got done feeding 5,000 people with nothing and walking on water. This is nothing compared to what we have been made to accomplish. Jesus is imagining all of that when the arms start grabbing him, pulling him into their boat. I can't fault the disciples. In their situation, I would have done the same thing. Because in their situation, I've done the same thing. I just walked you through every step of my life and how I worked to get God into my boat, to keep God safe. And I've done it after hearing all about the disciples' mistakes. But the time has come in our generation, in our world, we need to let God be big again. Bigger than hate. Bigger than the people we don't like. Bigger than our cans. Bigger than even the things that we would say that God would never do. Allow God to be God. Because guess what happens when we do that? God becomes God in our lives. God feeds 5,000 people with table scraps. God walks on water because he wanted to be with his friends. What part of your faith do you want to grow? What part of your humanness do you want to expand or leave behind? What part of God's miraculous kingdom do you want to live out here on earth now? We have been shown today it's waiting. That reality is out there. All we need to do is stop making God like us and start learning to walk out on the water with God.